Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this LinkedIn Live, and thank you also to all the ones that will be watching this event as a recording, because all our LinkedIn Live are indeed recorded, and so you will have the opportunity to also rewatch some of the elements that you may have found interesting. A great pleasure today to be with Owen Darbishire, not only a guest to this event, but also a friend. And we have been working together for a number of years. And I'm really delighted to have Owen with us today. And we will ask him to introduce him in a moment. But first of all, I want to make sure I see that I have a few people that mention I don't have the link, I'm unable to hear. So I just want to make sure that the technology is working well. So fixed. Okay, good to see that people are connected. Now, to be sure that indeed you're able to hear us correctly, how about if you share with us where are you located? Where are you currently? Where are you currently located, so that we will get an idea about the people that are with us today, right? It's gonna be mainly people from Britain because of Owen, from Italy because of me, Switzerland where I live, or we're gonna have people from all over the world. Let's see. Hello from Basel. Andre is there with us. Fantastic. And let's see. I'm sure that we are gonna have more people than that, more nationality, right? So I think yes. We even have people from the US. Thank you, Scott, for waking up nice and early in order to be with us. So we appreciate it. Then the Netherlands are with us, and some more Switzerland. In the gym, wow, that's somebody that is understood how it works, right? Says, okay, let me combine some exercise with some brain exercise. And then, Regina, hello, Regina, who also joined our last masterclass. So thank you very much, Regina, for being with us. And we have Carol, and we have Alessia, and Spain is also there. And okay, fantastic. Great. Then, as you telling us more about yourself, okay, we also, of course, someone from Saïd Business School at Oxford, fantastic. And then how about getting to know a bit more about today's guest? So, Owen, tell us a few words about yourself.
Well, Giuseppe, first, just it's a pleasure to be with you and to be doing this talk today, and my own welcome to everybody who is listening. And I'm particularly impressed by the notion of doing this in the gym. So that's an excellent one. I like that. So I'm Owen Darbishire, and I'm a professor at Oxford, where I've been located for over 25 years on the faculty. And in that role, I'm both in the Saïd Business School, which is the business school of the university. And then, given the way that Oxford works, I'm a fellow of Pembroke College. And in my roles, I run most of the negotiations teaching, and I oversee all of it, as well as being the academic director of our executive program, the Oxford program on negotiations. So that's my broad background. And inevitably, when you're thinking about negotiations, one angle which is not pure to negotiations but is critical within it, of course, is influence and persuasion, and how we go about thinking about that particular dimension of interactions. And of course, that's what we're going to be talking about today, as well as in our masterclass in the summer. So it's a pleasure to be here again.
Fantastic. Now, remember, this is your LinkedIn Live. So I do have some question for Owen, and you will probably have some question. So let's get to the most. And maybe let me start, I'll kick it off, and then we'll get to the question from the audience a bit later. But when trying to influence someone, how can we balance rational and emotional messages?
It's a very good question. And I think that one of the critical ways to start thinking about this is that the predominant approach of when people are thinking about how to influence somebody else is, what are the rational arguments that I can develop? What's the data I can put forward? And how am I going to, pile as much, data and proof upon the other person and impose it upon the other person as I can in order to get them to understand that they ought to do what it is that I want them to do. Now, I think that although that's the predominant approach, I think what we need to do is we need to take a little step back from that and try to sort of say, well, we might present lots of rational arguments, but what we need to do first is actually to have a little bit of a think about how people process information. Do they process it all as pure rational data where they're going to be convinced by it? Now, what we can do is we can take a sort of step aside and think in a crude terms, how does the brain work, right? And the model that has become was developed, I guess, as a simplification, and it's nothing more than that, by some people called Stanovich and West, but has been popularized most predominantly by Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner, is thinking about that we have two different systems of the way in which we think, system 1 and system 2, where system 2 relates to this sort of rational processing of information. But the trouble with that is, of course, that it is quite limited in its bandwidth, if you like, and it is we don't use it as our predominant method of decision making. And rather the system 1, which are subconscious processes, are really what account for, perhaps 85 to 90% of the decisions that we take are taken subconsciously. Now, I might just broaden the question a little bit from saying emotions to broader subconscious processes, which might include intuition and other sort of automatic heuristics, which are like rules of thumb, excuse me, that we use to process information. Now, when we receive information, we may be receiving a rational argument, but how does it resonate with us? How does it resonate emotionally with us? Now, if we think about rational arguments, there are many barriers that will prevent that actually being interpreted as a clear rational argument, or the barriers that are going to prevent us from being completely just simply persuaded by it. When we receive information, we interpret it according to what our own self-interest is. In other words, there's no such thing cognitively as objective data. We view data through the lens of what our own self-interests are, and that encourages us to have what's known as the confirmation bias. We search for information which supports our view, or motivated reasoning. We keep looking at data for long enough until we can find a way to mold that data to persuade us with to believe what we wanted to believe. Or another very famous cognitive effect is cognitive dissonance, where I might present you data which contradicts what your beliefs are, but what you've got a choice of then is saying, what am I going to hold on to, my beliefs or the data? Because if I believe the data, I've got to change my beliefs. Now, the stronger the values you have are, the more you're trying to influence somebody to change, in other words, the more likely it is that they're going to find an explanation internally of why this data is not particularly valid in this particular circumstance. So there's one other sort of important reason why we need to think about this sort of the way in which we process information, which is that there are a lot of different heuristics or biases in the way shortcuts. These are as to how we process information. So again, when we present something, the manner in which we present it has a big impact upon how that information is interpreted. So this is not to say, of course, that we don't want to present rational data, but what it is to say is we've got to understand that all of the information and all of the arguments we put forward, rational arguments, are still going to be interpreted in a significant way emotionally. So these two are not, in one sense, competing ways of approaching persuasion. We've got to actually understand that they're inherently integrated in what we as individuals actually do. So we need to think very hard as well about what it is that the person I'm talking to, how do they process information? Because individuals vary. But we also vary. We don't just vary as individuals, we vary as individuals according to how tired we are. The more tired we are, the more automatic the process that we happen to use to interpret information is. So understanding who you're trying to persuade, the situation you're trying to persuade them in, what their preferences are, but then make sure that you integrate both rational and emotional messages is the key.
Wow. Lots of richness in what you're describing. Now, there is one element that maybe I want to dig a bit deeper. You talked about the cognitive dissonance element, right? That people, if there is a big change versus what people believe, then people will find reasons to disqualify whatever you're mentioning. I mean, do you have any hints for our audience about how to deal with this? I mean, it's a difficult one, I guess, right?
Well, it is very difficult, but of course, part of it will come down to how you're presenting the information, how you frame the narrative, if you like. So if the information that you're presenting clashes with somebody's beliefs and values, then they are subconsciously going to resist that and be less likely to be persuaded. Now, if you have a good understanding of your audience, and that's absolutely a critical preparation dimension before you engage in any influence and persuasion activity. But if you understand the audience, then what you can do is you can try and think, how can I fit the message that I'm providing so that it is consistent with the values, the underlying values that this individual has. If I can present the information that is consistent with the values, then it's less of a challenge. They see it as an adjustment to what they believe and how they're going to, what they perhaps need to do, the actions that they need to take. But it won't be a fundamental challenge to them. And it's very, very easy when you present information, or what is known as framing information, to present it in two different ways. So, for example, I'll give you a sort of a small example of framing. I'm a professor who focuses on negotiations, but actually, for most people, and not for negotiation professors, but for most people, negotiations sort of implies something that is a bit of a battle. It's a sort of zero sum. You're going to win. You're going to take advantage of me. Am I going to lose, etc. Now, that's not how we think about negotiations, but most people do. And so actually, one of the things we might need to do is to frame the issue differently. We need to frame it perhaps as a problem-solving engagement. We're trying to solve a problem here to see how we can get the best contract that's going to add most value to both of our organizations. Now, if you present it in that different way, not as a negotiation, as a problem-solving exercise, I've tweaked what it is. They no longer see this as a challenge. They see it as a value-added engagement, and then you're going to get less resistance to the data that you're persuading of why this option is a good one.
Fantastic. Listen, there are already a lot of questions. Let me take just a quick one. Which are the external factors that impact the ratio between system 1 and system 2?
The external factors. It's a good question as to what's external and what's internal. Okay, so let me just sort of divide it into two different ways of thinking about it, because system 1 and system 2 are about how we process information. In that sense, they're the internal cognitive processing mechanisms. But there are a couple of different things that can impact which we use. One impact will be actually how tired somebody is. How long you've been working, how long have you been engaged on this particular task. The more tired you are, the more likely you shift from system 1 thinking over to system 2 thinking. So a very famous old example of this is parole boards when considering whether to grant somebody parole. It turns out that these vary systematically across the day. So when you start at the beginning of the day, people actively engage in reviewing the bits of data. And as they review the bits of data, they consider this on its own merits in a rational cognitive way, and you will get a lot more people granted parole than when the individual is tired towards the end of the day. And at which point, when they're tired, they default to what is my default decision. In most of these cases, the parole board's default decision is not to grant parole, and so you'll find that they don't grant it because they're tired and they haven't got any spare capacity cognitively left. The weather can make a change. The weather will impact what people's moods are and how they evaluate data. College admissions in America has been shown to be influenced by whether it's a sunny day or not a sunny day, and what types of individuals get offered positions, places according to that. But equally, the very way in which you present information, as I was suggesting before, can tap into either system 1 or system 2. In other words, I can present the same bits of information in a sort of rather sort of colder and more analytic way, and try to encourage the person to contemplate that data in a system 1 fashion, or I can present it in an emotional way and try and tap into the story that I am giving somebody. Actually, you tend to combine the two, but it's a question of how you combine them or what way you've got on each one. And as you then focus on this presentation of the data to an individual, it changes the way in which they will process it, and it becomes through a more automatic processing.
Fantastic. By the way, the two systems are also conflicting with each other, right? They are there, and you may end up taking one, let one prevail versus the other. And so let's say that, you are listening to this LinkedIn Live while having lunch. And then, you may be asking yourself, okay, should I have a dessert or not? And then, maybe the system 1, the intuitive side, the emotional side will tell you, yes, you are making an effort to learn even during lunch, you deserve a dessert. And the system 2, the rational side may tell you, oh no, you've been sitting all day, you cannot afford to put also dessert into your mind. So these are, how the two elements, may come and conflict into the others. Now,
Giuseppe, can I just comment? Vlad's a great comment on one way to find out about biases to know yourself, because we share many of them. I'm actually going to flip that on its head, Vlad, because I think it's a really interesting observation. Actually, one of the troubles is that we are not very good at introspection and seeing our own biases. A really good way to actually understand yourself is to look at the biases that other people have, recognize the second part of your sentence, we all share many of them, and then say, once I can see those biases in other people, the truth is, I might not like this, but the truth is, I probably share many of those biases.
Absolutely. Now, we talked about, how we present the information, how we frame it may indeed make a difference about how the image, how the message is accepted or not. And we often hear that stories are a powerful way to influence others. I mean, what can we do to develop a good story, Owen?
Yeah, I guess the first thing is that we might want to broaden that from stories to, to thinking about the examples or illustrations that we might particularly use, the anecdotes or the metaphors that we choose. In other words, we can use lots of different techniques to illustrate the particular point that we are trying to get across. We can draw anecdotes which, highlight and illustrate little bits of data that we are trying to put forward. And the truth is that, we might think of domains like scientists or others, where it's all rigorous evidence that is going to determine, what decision somebody makes or what beliefs they have. But actually, it's no less true with people in those rigorous analytic fields than it is elsewhere. And you'll often find sort of scientists, okay, hang on a minute, give me an illustration of this. Or, very analytical people in organizations, hang on a minute, how would this work in practice? Give me a concrete example of how we can make use of this. In other words, all data that, has ambiguities associated with it. There are different interpretations that are possible. There is uncertainty about how it would translate from one situation to another. And what stories and examples and illustrations do is that they help frame what it is that we're presenting. And when I talk about framing, what am I talking about? What I'm talking about is actually, in one sense, it's a critical feature of all management and all influence and persuasion, which is that everybody views the world through a lens. And what we can try and do is impact the lens through which somebody views a particular situation or a particular scenario, which helps facilitate an interpretation of how I should understand the data that is there. And so what the stories do is give us this interpretation, which then helps us think about what this would mean in the situation or the scenario that we are in. Now, in order to develop a good story or a good anecdote, metaphor, example, first thing is we've really got to understand the audience. Go back to that. We can't just do it from introspectively ourselves. What would resonate with me? Because you're not trying to persuade yourself. You're trying to persuade others. And so you've got to gain a good understanding and perspective of who it is you are trying to influence and persuade. Now, what we know from good evidence is that if you present concrete data and anecdotes side by side, the anecdote might effectively be, what some of us might think of as an N of one. It's just one case, and I've got the data here for lots of cases. But what we know, for the reason that we were just discussing about the emotional impact of sort of stories and examples, is that the anecdote, the example, has at least as powerful an impact as the story does. Now, what that says is don't think about these as competing. You could have a mantra, if you like, never have data without a story. because you need to combine the two effectively. Now, if anybody tries to persuade you by having a story without data, don't go for it. And if they're relying heavily, politicians are the worst at this. It's all about the single example illustration. Well, recognize what people are doing when they're doing that, and don't be overly persuaded by those single case examples. So sometimes, the tools that we use to influence and persuade others, we've got to be aware of how we defend ourselves against being overly influenced by them ourselves. But again, think about what it is that the audience care about, and then try to use stories and anecdotes which are going to resonate with them. So a different context, a different moment in time, a different organizational situation, a different culture, those, and I don't mean national, but I mean perhaps organizational as well as national, are going to mean you're going to choose and select different types of story to have the most powerful impact.
Fantastic. So, I mean, the message from Owen really demystified the topic of stories, right? It's not that all the time you have to think about, making a brand new storytelling with last 5 minutes, and you are completely inventing something that, it looks like a very challenging kind of things to do. You can simply effectiveness your way of communicating by adding an example, an anecdote, and this is going to really make your message more powerful. In fact, if you look at what we as professors do whenever we are explaining a concept, then we add a small example so that this makes the concept more clear. Now, we've been talking a lot about us talking, but Owen, would you say that you believe more in the power of persuasive arguments or the power of effective questions?
That's a great question, Giuseppe. And you're absolutely right that perhaps the most overused approach to influence and persuasion is one, if you like, a projection. We think about what arguments we are going to put forward, and we simply tell others of that. And there, in other words, there are sort of two different dimensions that we could perhaps think about sort of influence and persuasion, going across. One is, whether we have an internal orientation or a self-orientation. What do I think we ought to be doing? Or whether we do spend the time to really think about the audience that we are looking at, and say, how do I shape the message that I am designing so that it fits and resonates with them. The second dimension is whether we are projecting, if you like, we're expressing our views, we're telling others, we're saying, look, these are the benefits of this particular program that we want you to sign up to. That those sort of sell techniques. Or whether we are engaging people to a much greater extent in internal reflection, if you like, whether we're engaging them actively thinking about the particular issues that we are, sort of considering. Now, I think that we overuse. There is a place for any of these approaches, and you'll find visionaries. If you think about Steve Jobs, it was very much, here is my belief, and I'm going to tell you about it, and that works for certain individuals with certain bits of sort of following, credibility, etc. But it isn't necessarily, but it's overly used as the approach that people engage in. And what we need to recognize is that there's often an inherent resistance to people being just talked at, and you know, you're just trying to tell me what the benefits of something actually are. What we need to do is we need to go beyond that for at least two different sets of reasons. One is that we need to understand the person we're engaging with, you know, a lot better. And in negotiation situations, and I don't mean formal negotiations, I mean, you know, sort of often a much more informal, it might be intra-organizational negotiation, where you're trying to work out what approach would be best and help persuade people. One is that we've got to engage actively the people that we are trying to influence. What is remarkable is how important that actually is for people's feelings of respect, for their engagement with the ideas, and for their memory of what we're telling them, their beliefs in the appropriateness of something. So in other words, you know, actually we might think that we're persuading somebody only when we are talking to them. Actually, it turns out that that's not the only way of persuading people. If you can get somebody to engage actively with an idea, you can pose them hypothetical questions. What would you think? How would we, you know, resolve this particular issue? What can you think about a way in which we might meet these particular goals? As soon as somebody starts to actively engage in that idea, by speaking, they are persuading themselves. But by showing them respect, that we care about them, that we are listening actively to them, we are also increasing their memory of the discussions. So if you don't listen to somebody, and you can try this yourself, you know, try talking, you know, ask somebody a question, but then just don't, you know, after you've asked them a question, yeah, no, don't worry, I'm listening. Yeah. What you'll find is that as soon as you've got a bit of a distraction going on, then the person, they stop sharing information, they stop engaging with you, they don't even, they exchange much less information, they remember much less afterwards. So it's not just, you know, the importance of questions. It's the importance of what you are doing when you ask them questions. In other words, the purpose of questions has to be real, and you have to care about it, and you have to actively engage in that. You know, when they're talking to you, what are they saying? Why are they saying it? What's their tone? You know, what does this mean? What's their personal meaning to them? You know, that's what active listening is all about. Now, why is it so difficult to do? Well, roughly speaking, most people talk around 120 to 150 words a minute. We think in the range of about 600 to 800 words a minute. Now, we're thinking much, much quicker than the person is talking. And what that means is we tend to finish other people's thoughts for them. Our mind wanders. We get distracted by things. And so the only way to avoid that, and as soon as you do that, you're not showing people respect, and their level of belief in your credibility, their trust levels with you decline, and then you're going to be much less effective at influencing and persuading them. So what you have to do is you have to engage much more proactively. You ask them good questions, you follow up with more questions. That's a great sign that you respect their views. But you then you try to gather more information from them. One of the most remarkable things is sort of, you know, there's a notion called illusion of transparency. When we're talking to people, we think they understand what we're saying. Get 3 people to listen to the same interview and ask them at the end what the central message was, and they will all write it down, and they'll all come up with different things. We are nothing like as clear or transparent, you know, as we think we are. And as a professor, we've got Zeus here who was in my classes. I know what I meant to tell them. I've absolutely no idea what Zeus thought I said to him. It's one of those great challenges that we all face. But if we're interactive, then we've got a much greater chance of being able to follow up, probe, gather more information, as well as the fact we're having a bigger impact upon the person we're influencing, the person that we are trying to influence.
Yeah, great, Owen. Let me share, by the way, a piece of research that I was reading. You know, when you use facts of arguments, the success rate at influencing people, 24%. When you use question, 42%. So you can see how you can sharply increase your influence rate by asking more questions and making less facts. And this is also that already in the 17th century, Blaise Pascal, a French philosopher, had said that people are more convinced by the people that they discover themselves rather than the ones mentioned by others. So, if you make the learning process interactive, if you ask questions rather than making just facts and arguments. By the way, you were mentioning, Owen, about the workshop, the participants to your workshop. Let me take a moment to tell you that there is an opportunity to listen to Owen and myself very quickly, and this is coming in the form of an Influence and Persuasion Masterclass. It's an Influence and Persuasion Masterclass that Owen and I will be running very quickly, because we are talking today about the psychology of influence, right? But it's only a small part of the influence topic, right? Yes. And by the way, it is a theoretical level, right? We have limited amount of time. We're just telling you a lots of things, while what you get as you join us for a longer period of time is you get a broader set of concepts, and most important, role play, exercises, feedback, and that's really what makes the learning stick. Because otherwise, today you're going to get lots of ideas. It's nice, but how do I really implement it? So, if you're serious about negotiation, influence, and persuasion, then how about joining Owen and I for our Influence and Persuasion Masterclass? It takes place in Geneva, at Geneva Airport, just in front of the airport, walking distance from the airport. And there is also a train station over there. So you can come by train, you can fly, and this gives you the opportunity to spend a couple of days with not only with us, but with a group of bright people, great networking, and an opportunity to learn from each other. Joining those 2 days, plus a 2 years learning program over time to continue the learning journey, costs 3,000 Swiss francs, a bit less than 3,000 euros if you're not familiar with Swiss francs. Now, the good news is that until the end of March, so only for 5 days, the price is 1,800. So if you're interested, if you're serious about strengthening your influence and persuasion, how about joining us? And we're going to put the link into the question. Now, the question that you should ask yourself is: influencing really something that is going to help you succeed? Now, end of the sales speech, you can check the masterclass and see whether it fits for you. Why don't we take for a question from the audience and see whether we can answer Regina's question. What are your thoughts about how has the home office working concept impacted people's concept in processing emotional information differently, as working from home triggers different synapses in your brain to act?
Yeah, very interesting question, Regina. I think that one of the things is that what you're suggesting, in one sense, because we're working at home, we're using a different medium of communication when we're trying to interact with other people, and as soon as we use a different medium of communication, that can have a substantial impact. So, for example, when you are interacting with somebody in person, there are a range of things that happen. Firstly, we've got a richer source of information. So we haven't only got the verbal, we've got the what's called paraverbal, the ways in which people are sort of moving, how they're holding themselves, so their sort of body language. We've also got things like sort of touch, and actually even sort of shaking somebody's hand actually has an interesting impact. It releases oxytocin levels, which have impacts on levels of trust. And of course, trust is a critical variable in being able to influence and persuade somebody. When you're trying to influence and persuade somebody, what your credibility with them is, what your perceived competence, what the warmth that you project, all of these things are really important, because influencing and persuasion take place in the context of a relationship. And so the closer the relationship that you have means that that it's going to impact how you the effectiveness that you have. Or of course, if you're on the receiving end of it, if you're on the receiving end, you're much more likely to accept a request. So if somebody asks you a request, they try to influence you, will you do something for me, Regina? Your people are much more likely to accept that if it's asked in person than if it is asked remotely. And you are absolutely right that this the way in which our brains process information differs when it's in person and when it isn't. When we become more disinhibited, when the medium of communication is thinner. Now, Zoom is richer, of course, than is sort of email, but people will take offense more quickly on email, but they're also because they're disinhibited, they are more likely to become a little bit aggressive, but they're also a bit more willing to be deceitful, give you false information, which people are less likely to do when in person. So if you are, if you have the choice and you're trying to influence people, you are better off doing that in the richer medium of communication, i.e. in person. Now, there are exceptions to that. So if you are in a real conflict situation, sometimes actually the space can be really important at times, because anger can you get into a spiral. But more generally speaking, the richer the source of the communication, the better.
Okay, now let me build also on the topic of Owen, right? Trust indeed is built in different ways, whether it is physical or virtual. So trust in the physical element is indeed emotional, while trust virtually is behavior. So how you behave will then be the main driver, whether the person is going to trust you or not, right? So yes, it is indeed a different type of context. Fantastic. Now we have a couple of more comments. Okay, Excel rational, under 50 words per minute talking, 60 minutes per minute thinking, right? So are there any different defined by languages?
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. I think it's very unlikely, just because I don't think there are any languages that get to speak at between 600 and 800 words a minute. But that's the way in which we, the speed with which we can process information is just much greater. So I'm going to speculate, although I don't know the answer. At least I don't know research evidence of it, but I would be very surprised if there is a difference by language.
Okay, fantastic. Now let's go back to the corporate world, right? Because most of the people in our audience, are working in a corporate environment, and in most multinational companies, influencing internal stakeholder is more difficult, sometimes much more difficult than negotiating with external parties. I mean, why this is the case in your opinion, Owen?
Well, it's a really interesting question there, Giuseppe, as to exactly how true it is. Because I think there's day to day there are enormous bits of influence that go on within all types of organization. I think that sometimes we make a mistake when we are trying to influence internally, and we make a mistake by thinking that it should be easy. And of course, this impacts how we approach the process of trying to influence others. How much preparation, for example, do we do before going into this activity? Do we really think through what do we do a stakeholder mapping exercise and make sure that we are focused on the right individuals, that we are really sure who the decision makers are behind the table, not just at the table? Now, why is it that we might make that assumption? I think one of the reasons we might make that assumption is that we expect it to be easier, because we start from the proposition that we're all working for the same organization and that we are all trying to achieve the same objectives. But actually, people in different functions and different divisions or departments, actually, they still have what we often call an in-group and an out-group sort of bias. We are this department, we are this function, we've got our resources, we want to protect them. You're in a different department, you're coming in trying to grab it. Now, when we're thinking about trying to influence people in different organizations, we don't think of ourselves as purely having the same objective. But so we therefore, because we forget that when we work for the same organization, we just don't prepare and adopt the right approaches. We may not approach it systematically. If you're trying to influence somebody outside, you're much more likely to spend the time thinking about, there are lots of different influence tools that we can use. What tools am I going to use in this particular case? Why do I think that these are the appropriate ones? But we're probably less inclined to think that through systematically, to build those coalitions of support, which can be critical internally to get the momentum going. So I don't think that it is an inherently more difficult task. I suspect that it is more due to the way in which we approach the problem than when in contrast to when we're trying to influence people from other organizations.
Yeah. Well, let me share my perspective also on this one, because I became a professor at the end of my career after having worked in a corporate environment for over 25 years. And fully agree with the points of Owen, right? Preparation, we don't do the preparation, we assume it's going to be easier, but it's not. And in fact, when you're dealing with an external party, okay, the buyer wants to buy, the seller wants to sell, but when you're dealing with internal stakeholder, maybe they don't want to do the project that you're pushing very hard. So, it may not be that easy. And guess what? It's going to be difficult to build a strong button, right? When you're dealing with external, you may look for other alternatives, but if you want to get your engineering team to support your project, it's not going to be so straightforward to say, okay, I'm going to outsource the engineering and work with somebody else, right? Or you cannot escalate to management all the time. So there are, let's say, what I would say is that in the internal environment, there are many more factors that complicate the interaction. It may also be the reputation either that you have or the reputation of your department. If your department is perceived as a department that doesn't bring much added value, then this may also impact your ability to be influential with stakeholders, right? So yes, there may be really a number of things that makes the internal element quite complicated. Now let's take one last question from the audience, and here we have it. Vlad, we often see strong polarization in society. How to approach this situation? Now, maybe before you give your piece, Vlad, Owen, I just made a video about confirmation bias, so I'm going to share in the chat some insights that may also be helpful to Vlad, if you want to see some more. But Owen, if you want to say a few words as well, let me quickly put the video onto the chat. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a tricky one, and we are becoming more polarized for a number of reasons that we can talk about. The notion of group polarization has been one that has been common, if you like, for a long time, which is that if you put a group of people together who have similar views, at least in terms of their general orientation is in one direction or another, then what happens is that they once they start talking to each other, they can actually become more polarized, more extreme than any of them were at the outset. And there are a number of different reasons for that. A couple are that firstly, you start defining yourself as the group who prefer X or Y. I'm the group that prefer this, and I see myself in contrast to the group who believe something different. So we're organization X, they're organization Y. We believe in this particular policy which has high risk. They believe in that policy which is being very cautious. Now, once you start defining yourself in opposition to somebody else, that drives you further apart, because you sort of start to look for what we, as from an academic term, we call prototypical. What is the prototypical view here? It's the purer view, if you like, and we contrast it with the other side. Another important driver, which is, I think, particularly important in our current context, is information. And the information element is that if you get a group of people together who are of a very similar view, I've gone into a particular discussion with 3 ideas of why we should do something. You've gone in with 3 ideas, but one of them overlaps with mine, but you've got 2 additional ideas about why we should do it. Once we've started to have a discussion, by the end of the discussion with both of us and a few others, we find that we've got 7 ideas of why we should do it. And as soon as the conversation starts moving towards this information load, then we start suppressing counter views. And so to enhance our group membership, we then have added a sort of increasing data, if you like, as to why we should believe this particular position. Now, what we have constructed a world where social media in particular tends to foist information upon people which is consistent with the information that they have looked at previously. In other words, we've created a scenario where people's views are being constantly reinforced and not challenged. within an organization or a group, what is the fundamental thing you can do is you want to have diversity of cognitive views, right? It's cognitive diversity that is absolutely critical. Don't just think you can get people from, who all think the same, but have different, ethnic or other, gender backgrounds, etc. They've got to have cognitive diversity. Now, if you can bring cognitive diversity together, we'll generate more different ideas, and we'll be then be able to be much more clear cut in the evaluations that we come to. What that suggests for social media is we need a very different way that information is foisted upon people, and there is a real danger insofar as people just have information pushed on them which simply replicates what their current views are.
Absolutely. The search engines is going to do this as well. So, there are a number of dangerous bias. That's why we believe what we believe about vaccine, right? There are people that are fully convinced that vaccine are great, and there are people that are fully convinced that vaccine are evil. And this is part of the process, that Owen just described. Now, of course, we just touched the surface about what's his influence and persuasion. If you're serious about getting more about the topic of negotiation and influencing, then we have the opportunity for you is join us for the masterclass. Spend a couple of days with us and with a number of senior executives that will be there as well. And here's the link again to the masterclass you find on the chat. And we have a special promotion only until the 30th of March. To conclude, very briefly, is which is one thing that our audience can easily do to become better influencer?
One thing. I'm going to go back to what we talked about earlier, which is about questioning and listening. I think that the more active the engagement that you have with the people that you're trying to influence, the more you show the respect for them, because that has a fundamental impact upon their own self-identity. Listen to them, carefully, thoughtfully, respectfully. That doesn't mean you agree, but if the moment that people believe that you care about what their views are, they're much more likely to care about what your views are, and they're much less likely to be automatically resistant to it.
And Owen, it was exactly the same one that I had in mind. I think, indeed, yes, that's, work on your influencing, and maybe as a concrete tip to get better in the listening, don't say to yourself, okay, this week I'm going to focus on listening. Tell to yourself, in the next meeting with my boss, I'm going to paraphrase her twice, right? Small period of time, a specific thing. That is going to make it very concrete. It's called the deliberate practice in technical terms. And that is going to help you to work on one competence at a time and get better at that. Owen, it was a real pleasure, as usual, to spend some time with you. Look forward to see you in Geneva in June soon. And to all the participants, thank you for your questions, your comments, your ideas, and look forward to reconnect with you again also for forthcoming LinkedIn Live. Thank you again. All the very best. Enjoy your weekend. Bye-bye.
Thanks.